Hi again, this is Rick Partlow coming at you from How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. If you watched the first video, then you know who I am and what this is all about. But if you didn't, if this is the first one that you've come across, I am Rick Partlow. I am a science fiction writer. I have written 43 science fiction novels, 40 of which are already published. They're mostly military science fiction with some space opera. I have done pretty well. I've had probably 20, 25 of them have been in bestseller categories at one point or another. The highest I've ever ranked was in the top 50 in the entire Amazon Kindle store. So I've done okay. I'm not Stephen King. I'm not even Michael Anderle, if you know who he is. But I've done probably better than about 98% of authors. So I'm not totally unqualified to speak to people about craft, about the business. So last time I went into some just general advice for how to write entertaining science fiction. This time I want to get a little bit more specific. I want to talk about characterization. Building characters is probably the weakest point that I see in most of the science fiction I read, and military science fiction in particular. The people that can do it well are the people that succeed, the people that get readers loyal to them. Because readers, they may like a really good plot, a really good setup, but what draws them back, what makes them pick up the same author's books over and over, is the characters. If you don't write characters people love and relate to and want to read more about, then you're not going to get a following. You may sell a book or a series well because it's something that a particular group of people is interested in, but if you don't do characters well, then the readers are not going to come back to you and look for your name when they look for a new book. Now, military science fiction is particularly guilty of this. I read a lot of it. I read a lot of indie military science fiction because it's the most available and cheapest. And a lot of it reads like the game sessions from a role-playing game. Or sometimes if the people have military experience, it reads like an after-action review. It means you just tell the facts, what happened, and there's no emotion, there's no engagement. So what you need to do is come up with realistic characters. Now, the first place that you get realistic characterization from is not going to be what you think. Because everybody's going to think, I'll go to real people, which is a good idea. You want to get real people. You want to have a broad spectrum of characteristics you can draw from. But just putting real people on a page doesn't always work because real people are very complicated. They're very involved. They have a whole life's worth of experiences, and that's not always possible to convey in the written word. What you need is a literary version of real people. And the only place you can get good experience with literary versions of real people is by having read. To be an author, and I cannot stress this enough, you have to have read a lot. It's just like anything else. If you want to succeed in any business, you have to get experience. And in writing, that means writing and it means reading. If you did not read a lot as a child, I'm sorry to tell you, and I don't mean to be discouraging, but it's going to be a lot harder for you to be a good writer because good writers were readers. Almost every single writer that I admire and look up to and want to emulate, when you read their biography, articles about them, interviews with them, they read a lot as a kid. So if you didn't read before, now's the time to start. You may think, oh, I want to write. Yes, but you need to keep reading. And even if you're a successful writer, I mean, I'm fairly successful. I read constantly, whenever I have the time. It's not just to keep up with the competition, although writers aren't really competing with each other because people don't buy one book instead of another. They buy two books. The readers who are really dedicated to their genre just buy everything. But not just to keep up with other people in my field, but because it helps me to broaden my palette. Like when an artist has a palette with paints on it, they can use to paint pictures, paint portraits. And reading a new book is like getting a new shade of a color. You get new ideas, you get new nuances that you can use. So reading is incredibly important to building characters. So beyond reading, and by the way, reading not just in your genre, don't just go out and read just military science fiction or just science fiction. Read everything that interests you. Read, if you're interested enough in it, read historical fiction, read westerns, read military thrillers, and also read history, because history is very important to making your background, your world building more realistic. But for building characters, read different styles of novels. Read the greats, and I don't mean just like the greats like Shakespeare or Chaucer. Read the people who have made a huge living at writing, and figure out how they came up with their characters. Figure out what makes their characters special. Pardon me. There's oak pollen season here in Florida again, and it's getting to me. So, after reading, what is the next place to go to look for characters? Now, military science fiction, it's a unique problem and an opportunity. It's an opportunity because war is universal. The reaction to it by people is universal. And even if it weren't, even if people reacted differently to it, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, the people who are reading about the war that you're writing, they live now. So you want to find out how people that live now react to violence, how they react to loss, how they react to danger, how they behave in a military unit. So you need to read biographies. Read biographies about modern warfare and about ancient warfare if you like, although bearing in mind that people back then had a different mindset to it. And that's kind of funny. A good place to look for your aliens would be in our history, because someone once wrote, and I forget who, that the average Roman citizen was more alien to a modern person than any of the aliens on Star Trek. And that's true. So you want people to relate to your characters, then you're going to have to try to draw from more modern characters, because people in Roman times, in medieval times, they reacted differently to danger, to privation than we do. I mean, they're human, so it's a human reaction, but they had a fatalism that we do not have anymore. It's gone out of style with the Renaissance. So if you're reading books about like medieval soldiers or Roman soldiers, how they react is going to be useful in just getting a sense of the broad spectrum of humanity. But if for your main character, if you want your readers to relate to them, don't make your main character react to privation and war like a Roman centurion, because people are going to read that and think, that doesn't sound like anybody I know. So try to stick to World War II and later. Even the people in World War II were a lot more case hardened than we are today. So it might be good to read a lot about veterans of the Vietnam War and forward. So a lot of books about the average soldier in the Great War, the Grand War on Terror, from 2001 onward, and that should give you a bunch of sources as to the mindset of a soldier. A look into how people think in situations like that. Of course, if you are a veteran, if you've seen combat, then you have that idea already. But I would still recommend reading a good deal on the subject, reading a lot of different biographies and accounts of individual soldiers, because people tend to get the idea that their experience is the only one or the most prevalent one. But I have a lot of friends and family who have been in combat zones. And I was in the military, and I was in during the Gulf War, showing my age there, but I did not see any action because I was stuck in a unit that was light infantry, which means that we got flown around in helicopters and then walked the rest of the way. And what they wanted in the Gulf War was people in mechanized infantry who could drive around in APCs and keep up with the tanks. So I did not see combat. But I know that people who have seen combat, they tend to think that their way is universal. But I've talked to my son, my nephews, my best friend, the best man at my wedding, people I went to college with. They all saw combat in the War on Terror, and their experiences could not be more different. I mean, there's things that are universal, obviously, and there's things that were true theater-wide, but just being in a few months apart, being in a different unit, you get a different experience. So if you want a broad spectrum to draw from, because you're not going to be taking, say you find the biography of the perfect person that really speaks to what you're trying to say in your book, you're still not going to just take that person and plant them in your book. I mean, you shouldn't. For one thing, somebody is going to have read about that person, and it's going to be obvious to them what you did. But mostly because you want the character to be original to you. And also because I don't want to put this in the wrong way. I don't want to sound like I'm bad-mouthing anybody. But regular people who you read about in these books, almost everybody has feet of clay at some point. So you're going to read about a man who is a hero in the war, and then he gets back and he has problems, or people say things about him, and it doesn't sound like, oh, that's not a hero. It's because we have this idea that superheroes like Greek gods, but people are people. But when you write a story that you're trying to sell, that you want people to be involved with, your characters have to be not quite realistic. Because realistic people, they, especially, just admitting it, people that do well in a war often don't do as well in peacetime. So you look up a guy who was an incredible hero in Iraq, and he comes home and he has a hard time finding a job, or he has a hard time keeping his marriage going, or he starts drinking and gets a DUI. And it's not that there's a bad person, or that the war made him a bad person. It's just that, like, the personality of someone who can do well in a really high stress situation and get used to that kind of stress sometimes doesn't adapt well to low stress situations or a different kind of stress. So you have to be careful that you don't give your character too many flaws, because the objective is not just to write a realistic military science fiction novel. The objective is to write a novel that will draw people back, and to create a character that will draw people back. So even if your character has, problems, like all characters have problems they have to overcome, they have to have the potential to overcome those problems. They have to show that they are making progress. They have to show that they're not too good to be true, but just a little bit better than true. Because people come back to characters that are close enough to true to see that they have the same temptations and struggles that we do, but just a little bit better than true because they overcome them. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for somebody who's a lot like them, except just a little better. So even if it's an anti-hero, even if it's a rogue, they may be, morally gray, but when it comes down to it, they're just a little better than we are, than your average person is. So, where to get these characters? Where to get the real people from? Where do you draw it from? Don't read biographies about generals, because usually you run into one of two types of books: either hagiographies where everything they did was great, or deconstructions where everything they did was suspect, and it's all to show you what a bad person they were. But that's not what you want. You want probably someone who's no higher than a captain and probably start as lieutenant, or enlisted man who eventually became a mid-rank NCO. But you don't want somebody who is too high up in the ranks, because you want, at some point when you get that high up, your mindset changes to one that is like, I don't want to put this, it's not like they only think about the military, but their whole career has been the military. So there's a disconnect between the civilian life and somebody who's been in the military long enough to be like a sergeant major or a colonel. They think of things differently. They have a different language, different dialogue inside their head. So you want somebody who's been a civilian more recently than that, because you're going to be writing this book and it's going to sell mostly to civilians. Maybe people who are in the military will want to read it too. Hopefully they will. But most of your customers are going to be civilians. So you want people who admire the military, maybe wanted to be in the military, but didn't. And you need to connect with them. So having a character based on real people that have been civilians more recently really helps to connect with the reader. It gives them a transition from where they are to where that character is. Other things about character building. Family. People tend to forget about family. I mean, they might mention it once or twice, but if your character has a family, it's going to be very significant to them. I mean, real people, their families are incredibly significant. I mean, their brothers and sisters in arms become their family as well, but they're constantly thinking about back home, about their families. So if you have a military science fiction with a character who's been taken off Earth or somewhere and shoved into a war, you need to have their family be significant to them. That needs to be something they think about a lot. It needs to be a big part of their character. And not just mentioning, oh, well, I miss my mom. No, they're going to think about home a lot. People in a war think about home constantly. So, and don't forget to, if it's not possible to have contact with their family, then you need to explain why. But in the future, I would think even in cases of like an interstellar war, if we can go faster than light to get there, we can get messages faster than light. So if your main character has a family, you should hear from them once in a while. A good way to get around the problem with exposition is to write a letter, record a message, and not necessarily spilling everything out, because you've got to remember you don't tell your family everything that's going on in wartime, but just it can be a means of both exposition and character building. So don't forget that your main character has a family. And even in non-military science fiction, just space opera, I've seen that forgotten a lot. You read these characters and you think they just appeared out of whole cloth, they were hatched from an egg, because they never talk about where they came from, about their mom and dad, about their brothers and sisters. You think they didn't have any, but everybody has a family, and it's usually very significant to them. So when you're character building, don't forget that your character has a family, and if they're dead, that's going to be a big part of who they are. If somehow their whole family died, or if they're estranged from their family, that's going to mold them as a person. So don't just blow that off. Don't just say, oh yeah, parents are dead. Well, your parents died young, especially if you're talking about a science fiction story where people can live hundreds of years and medical science has progressed, to where most people don't die of accidents or disease. Well, how did your parents die? Because not a lot of people would die unless unless they put themselves in dangerous situations. Were they scouts? Were they in the military? How did they die? That would have a very big significance to your character. So when you're writing a character, unless they're just old enough that they would have drifted away from their family, you need to think about things like that. You need to mention it. I mean, it may not be a big part of the story, but if it's not going to be, you need to figure out why. Because that's something people will expect. And it's something that will make your character three-dimensional. The fact that they think about their mom and dad, their sister, their brother, their uncle. All right, so important parts of characterization: reading, real people obviously, reading nonfiction biographies, and family. One final part of characterization is relationships, not necessarily romantic ones, but just in general. I read a lot of science fiction especially military science fiction, where people become just close friends with someone very suddenly. And that can happen in the military. I mean, you get thrown into basic training or boot camp, whichever one you're in your bunkmate, your battle buddy, sometimes you become very close friends and it lasts a long time. But in general, I would like to read more about friends who they aren't so much thrown together as they are similar types of people or complementary types of characters. Like, for instance, in Glory Boy, the main character, he's straight-laced country boy hick from a backwater religious colony, and his best friend is an urbane, really good-looking, fast-talking ladies' man who comes from the big city. Now, that's kind of cliche too, but it works because of that, because the main character doesn't know a lot of the things that you want to tell your readers about the world. So if you have somebody who's more experienced, as in that one, you can explain without explaining, without telling how things are different in different places. So I find that useful as a storytelling device. Now, romantic relationships. That's another thing that bugs me. A lot of people who write science fiction want to make their romances TV romances or, tropey romances. Let me say that. I don't write romance in my science fiction. I write about relationships because people have them. So unless you're writing a science fiction romance, don't do the tropes. Don't do the meet cute and the misunderstanding and then they get together later and live happily. That's not what this is. That's not the kind of story this is. This is science fiction. This is military science fiction or space opera. So what you want is relationships that build the story. You want someone who you want your character to be in a relationship with someone who is right for that part of their story arc. Just as an example, in Glory Boy, the main character starts off as a farmer on this backwards religious agri-colony, and he has a teenage girlfriend, and they talk about big plans, but when the time comes that he joins the military, she's ticked off that he is leaving her, and they weren't really in love. They were like teenagers, so they break up. And he misses her, but they were teenagers, and you get over that quickly. So then he has a fling with somebody in his unit. That's probably a mistake, and she realizes it before him. And then he has his first real relationship with someone he meets, and it's a relationship that real people have. It's not like, oh, well, this is a big misunderstanding, and I hate you. No, they met each other, they got along, they realized they were attracted, and they started a relationship. And the important part wasn't that part. That's not the kind of book this is. The important part is that she was important to him in a segment of his character arc where he needed to grow up. He needed to understand that he had responsibilities and that he was in the military now and he was an officer and he had to act like an adult. And she was a part of him becoming an adult, of him becoming responsible, and coming to accept his role in the military, because a lot of him was still that small town farmer boy. And then when she died, he became very cynical, and he lost the focus on his career that he had and on his purpose. So when he had to go back to his home world because it was being invaded by the enemy, and he ran into his childhood sweetheart again, and they rekindled the relationship, it was a different kind of relationship because she was older, she'd been married, she'd had a child, her husband and her daughter had died. She'd been hardened by all these events, and he'd been hardened too, and they needed something from their old lives to soften that hard shell and bring them both back to what they were. So that's the difference between a romantic relationship in a science fiction or a military science fiction novel and a romance. You don't want a romance. You don't want a tropey romantic comedy romance in your science fiction novel. You want a relationship that, if not totally realistic, is more real. It has verisimilitude to it. All right, so to sum up, you want real characters and to find out how they react in stressful situations. Talk to your friends, talk to your family. Read fiction, well-written fiction, and read biographies. And if you're going to have relationships in your series, make them realistic relationships, or more realistic, not tropey relationships. One final note, I mentioned speaking to your friends and family who are vets about their experiences. Don't necessarily ask them about their own character. Don't necessarily draw your character from them and what they did, because for one thing, they're friends and family. They probably will find out. They may not be happy about it. Ask them who the funniest guy in their unit was. Ask them who the bravest guy in their unit was. Ask them who the most squared away guy in their unit was. Get them to tell stories about that guy. Where is he from? What did he do? What were his habits? What kind of a guy was he? Those are the people you draw your characters from. Just be very careful about drawing them from people you know well and hang around a lot, because that could end badly. So basing your characters on real people is risky if you know those real people in real life. And if that character does something bad, they might not like it. Just a little warning. All right, so if you want to get in touch with me, my email address is dutyhonor487@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Facebook at facebook.com/dutyhonorplanet, or you can go to my website, which is rickpartlow.com. I have a Twitter account that I don't even remember the name for, and I rarely ever use, so please don't bother. Or you can leave a comment on this YouTube video. So please subscribe, You can share it with your friends. I am going to try to do this on a regular basis if I can think up some more stuff to talk about. And I will hopefully see you guys next time, and have a good one.